Imagine you're a prehistoric human. You've just spent 12 grueling hours tracking a mammoth through the mud, your feet hurt, your back aches, and you just want to sit down and do absolutely nothing. Then your friend comes up to you, holds out a hollowed out gourd filled with some weird, slightly fizzy, suspiciously sour fruit juice, and says, by means of a series of enthusiastic grunts, try this. You do. And then, slowly, the world gets a little softer. The fire feels warmer. Your mammoth hunting failure feels a lot less catastrophic. And somewhere deep inside that increasingly relaxed prehistoric brain of yours, a thought forms, possibly the most consequential thought in human history. We need to make more of this. That, my friends, is the moment civilization was essentially born. Or at the very least, that's one version of the story. Because when historians and archaeologists start digging into the question of when humans first started drinking alcohol, what they find isn't just a story about fermentation chemistry or ancient party culture. It's a story about human nature itself, about pleasure, ritual, agriculture, religion, and the very strange fact that we might have started farming not because we were hungry, but because we really, really wanted beer. Buckle up because we're going back. Way back. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind a little. When most people think about ancient alcohol, they picture ancient Egyptians sipping beer or Roman wine flowing through marble halls. That already feels pretty old, right? We're talking a few thousand years ago, but the actual history of humans and alcohol doesn't start there. Not even close. The relationship between our species and fermented beverages is so old that it actually predates modern human beings as a species. Let that sink in for a second. In 2021, scientists studying the genetics of enzymes, specifically an enzyme called ADH4, which helps break down alcohol in the body, traced the evolutionary history of this enzyme across dozens of primate species. What they found was extraordinary. Roughly 10 million years ago, our ancient primate ancestors evolved a dramatically more efficient version of ADH4. This new version was 40 times better at processing alcohol than the previous version. And this didn't happen by accident. Evolution is ruthlessly practical. If a genetic mutation sticks around and spreads through an entire population, it's because it was useful, helpful, maybe even critical for survival. So why would a 10 million-year-old primate need to metabolize alcohol more efficiently? The most compelling theory is what scientists call the drunken monkey hypothesis. Yes, that's a real scientific theory. And yes, the name is exactly as wonderful as it sounds. The idea, first proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, is that our ancient ancestors survived partly by eating fermented fruit that had fallen from trees. Ripe fruit that sits on the ground long enough starts to ferment naturally. The yeast in the environment goes to work on the sugars, producing ethanol, the same alcohol found in your wine, your beer, your fancy cocktail with the tiny umbrella. Now, for most animals, ethanol is basically a poison in any significant quantity. But for these proto-primates living in forests full of fallen, fermenting fruit, the ability to detect and process alcohol became a survival skill. Alcohol has a distinctive smell that carries through the air, helping them locate ripe food sources from a distance. And being able to metabolize it without immediately keeling over meant they could eat more of the fermented fruit, getting more calories, more nutrients. In a world where every calorie counted, this was a massive advantage. So in a very real sense, humans didn't invent drinking. We inherited it. It was baked into our biology millions of years before we were even human. But okay, biology aside, when did our actual human ancestors start deliberately making and drinking alcohol? That's where things get really interesting. For a long time, the oldest confirmed evidence of intentional alcohol production came from ancient China. In 2004, archaeologists excavating a site called Jiahu, a village dating back to around 7000 BCE, found chemical residues inside pottery shards that told a fascinating story. Using a technique called gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, they analyzed the residue and identified traces of beeswax, tartaric acid from grapes or hawthorn berries, and other organic compounds. The pattern was unmistakable. This was fermented alcohol, a mixed drink made from rice, honey, and fruit produced by people who lived around 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, this predates the construction of Stonehenge by roughly 5,000 years. These people were making intentional alcoholic beverages before the wheel was even a concept, before writing, before most of what we consider civilization had emerged. And here they were, crafting what was essentially an ancient version of a fruit punch cocktail. This discovery was made by chemist Patrick McGovern, who became something of a legend in this particular corner of archaeology. He even worked with a craft brewery, Dogfish Head, to recreate the ancient jiahu drink, which they sold commercially under the name Chateau Jiahu. People drank a genuine recreation of 9,000-year-old booze, and apparently it was pretty good. Floral, slightly tart, with a honey finish. Ancient humans had taste, but jiahu wasn't the end of the story. As archaeologists kept digging, both literally and figuratively, the dates kept getting pushed back further. In the Middle East, the region known as the Fertile Crescent, evidence started emerging of alcohol production that rivaled or even predated the Chinese findings. Clay jars discovered at a site called Haji Firuz Tepe in modern-day Iran, dating to somewhere between 5,400 and 5,000 BCE, contained residues of tartaric acid and resin from tree bark, both indicators of wine. This was wine being produced in ancient Iran about 7,000 years ago. And researchers think this almost certainly wasn't the beginning. This was just the oldest evidence that happened to survive and be found. The actual starting point was probably earlier. How much earlier? Well, here's where it gets philosophically interesting. There's a debate that's been brewing, pun absolutely intended, among archaeologists and anthropologists for decades. It's called the beer before bread hypothesis, and it's one of the more delightfully provocative ideas in all of human history. The standard story of civilization goes something like this. Hunter-gatherers eventually figured out they could grow their own food, so they settled down, started farming grain, and civilization followed. Agriculture was born from necessity. People needed to eat. But some researchers started noticing something odd. If you look at the archaeological evidence, the cultivation of grain in many regions doesn't seem to be well explained by caloric necessity alone. Hunter-gatherers, it turns out, were often nutritionally better off than early farmers. They had more diverse diets, worked fewer hours, and in many cases were healthier. So why would they voluntarily settle down to the grueling, repetitive work of farming? One answer that keeps coming up: fermentation. Beer. The theory goes that humans didn't start growing grain primarily to eat it. They started growing it because grain is exactly what you need to make alcohol at scale. Fermented grain beverages, essentially early beer, had enormous social, spiritual, and nutritional value. They could be used in religious ceremonies, offered to gods, shared at communal feasts to bind communities together. And the caloric content of fermented grain beverages isn't nothing. Ancient beers were thick, nutritious, almost like a liquid bread. Drinking them was, in a genuine sense, a form of eating. The strongest piece of evidence supporting this hypothesis came in 2018 when archaeologists working at a site called Raqefet Cave in Israel announced a spectacular discovery. Inside the cave, they found stone mortars that date back roughly 13,000 years. These weren't just any stone mortars, they showed signs of having been used to grind grain and store plant material, and crucially, microscopic analysis of the residue inside them revealed traces consistent with fermentation. Beer making in a cave 13,000 years ago, by a people called the Natufians, who were still largely hunter-gatherers, living before agriculture even began. 13,000 years. To put that another way, humans were making beer approximately 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. The Natufians are a particularly fascinating group because they sit right at the transition point between hunter-gatherers and settled agricultural societies. And the fact that evidence of brewing appears right at this transition period, possibly even slightly before it, is exactly what the beer before bread crowd had been predicting. It suggests that the desire to produce fermented beverages at scale was one of the motivating forces that pushed humans toward agriculture rather than the other way around. Now, not every archaeologist is fully on board with this hypothesis. Critics point out that the evidence is open to interpretation. Grain could have been ground and stored for reasons other than fermentation, and the dietary necessity argument for agriculture has plenty of support too. Most mainstream archaeologists think the truth is somewhere in the middle. Humans had multiple motivations for settling down and farming, and fermented beverages were likely one significant factor among many. But the fact that this debate is happening at all, that serious scientists are genuinely arguing that beer might be one of the reasons civilization exists, is something I find extraordinarily wonderful. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about what ancient alcohol actually was, because it was very different from what we think of today. First of all, forget the clear, refined, precisely calibrated beverages we're used to. Ancient alcohol was messy, it was thick, it was inconsistent, it was produced without any real understanding of what was actually happening chemically. Humans just knew that if you left certain substances alone for long enough, something interesting occurred. The something interesting, of course, was yeast doing its metabolic work, consuming sugars and producing carbon dioxide and ethanol as byproducts. But ancient people didn't know about yeast. To them, fermentation was mysterious, magical, divine. And this is the point where alcohol's history intersects in a profound way with the history of religion. Across virtually every ancient culture we have significant records of, fermented beverages played a central role in religious practice. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians had a goddess of beer named Ninkasi, and her hymns, dating back to around 1800 BCE, doubled as brewing recipes. The Hymn of Ninkasi is quite literally a song that describes, step by step, how to make beer. It praises the goddess for her gift of this sacred substance, describes the filtering of the brew through reeds, the mixing of honey and wine, the pouring of the finished product. It is simultaneously a hymn and a practical instruction manual, which might be the most ancient form of sponsored content in human history. In Egypt, beer was fundamental to both daily life and the afterlife. Workers who built the pyramids, real workers, not slaves as is commonly portrayed, but paid laborers, were given daily rations of beer as part of their compensation. We have the records, about 4 to 5 liters of beer per day per worker. This wasn't recreational drinking, although I'm not going to pretend the end of a day hauling limestone blocks didn't call for some relaxation. It was nutrition. Ancient Egyptian beer was thick, relatively low in alcohol compared to modern standards, full of nutrients and calories. It was safe to drink in ways that the local water often wasn't, because the fermentation process kills many harmful bacteria. And when Egyptians died, they expected the party to continue. Tomb paintings are full of banquet scenes, brewing scenes, people joyfully consuming wine and beer. High-status burials frequently included actual containers of beer and wine, real physical provisions for the journey into the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians packed alcohol in their tombs the same way you might pack snacks for a long road trip. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece, wine was so central to culture that they had an entire god dedicated to it. Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, ritual madness, and theater. The consumption of wine was tied to the concept of becoming more than human, stepping outside the ordinary boundaries of existence and touching something divine. The symposium, the formal drinking gathering of ancient Greek men, wasn't just a drinking party, it was a philosophical institution. They drank, debated, recited poetry, argued about justice and beauty and the nature of the cosmos. Plato's famous dialogues, some of the most influential philosophical texts ever written, are set at symposia. Western philosophy was, in a very literal sense, conducted over wine. The ancient Andean cultures had chicha, a fermented maize beverage that was central to religious ceremonies, labor exchanges, and political power. The Inca Empire used chicha distribution as a form of governance. You came to work on state projects, and the state provided chicha. It was a social contract fermented in a clay pot. Archaeological sites in Peru have revealed enormous brewing facilities. Essentially, ancient industrial breweries capable of producing hundreds of liters of chicha at a time for major ceremonial events. In Northern Europe, before the influence of wine culture from the Mediterranean, the drink of choice was mead, fermented honey mixed with water, sometimes with berries, herbs, or grains added for flavor. Mead is arguably the oldest alcoholic beverage with a continuous recorded history because honey ferments naturally when it gets wet, and humans figured this out very early. Norse mythology is soaked, again pun intended, in mead. In the Norse cosmological view, there's a magical mead called the Mead of Poetry, made from the blood of a wise being named Kvasir, mixed with honey by dwarves. Drinking it supposedly granted the ability to compose great poetry and speak wisdom. The Norse concept of paradise, Valhalla, involved slain warriors feasting and drinking mead for eternity. Eternal warrior heaven was fundamentally an open bar situation. What all of these cultures share is the treatment of fermented beverages as something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary, something that connected humans to powers larger than themselves. And this makes sense when you think about it. Imagine experiencing intoxication for the first time without any framework for understanding what was happening to you. You drink this strange liquid, and the world shifts. Fear diminishes. Connections to other people feel deeper and more real. Your thoughts flow in unexpected directions. You feel briefly like you're touching something beyond the everyday grind of survival. Without neuroscience, without chemistry, without pharmacology, what would you call that experience? Of course you would call it divine. Of course you would build ritual and religion around it. There's actually a serious body of academic thought suggesting that alcohol and other psychoactive substances played a significant role in the development of human religious and spiritual thinking broadly. The psychedelic hypothesis of religious origins is controversial, but it's taken seriously by enough researchers that it's worth acknowledging. The idea isn't that religion is nothing but intoxication, but rather that altered states of consciousness, including those produced by fermented beverages, gave early humans a felt sense of transcendence and connection that contributed to the development of spiritual frameworks. When you experience something that dramatically alters your consciousness and seems to reveal hidden aspects of reality, you remember it. You tell other people about it, you build stories and rituals around it, you try to recreate it. Now, here's something that might complicate your view of ancient drinking. It wasn't always the celebration and communion affair we might romanticize. Ancient cultures also showed an awareness, sometimes quite sophisticated, that alcohol could cause problems. The Egyptians, who loved their beer so deeply, also produced cautionary texts. One instructional papyrus warns students against spending too much time in taverns, noting that the habitual drinker is like a broken oar, unable to steer any direction. The Sumerians, for all their goddess of beer devotion, had legal codes that included regulations on taverns and their owners. Ancient Rome famously struggled with what we might today call public health crises related to wine consumption, and some Roman physicians wrote about the damaging effects of excessive drinking with a clarity that wouldn't be out of place in a modern medical journal. The ancient Chinese texts include critiques of drunken behavior. Confucian philosophy had nuanced views on alcohol. It was appropriate in ritual contexts, useful in moderation, but excessive indulgence was considered a moral failing and a sign of disorder. In the mythology of China's earliest historical dynasties, the fall of certain rulers is attributed in part to their excessive drinking. So ancient humans weren't naive about alcohol. They understood that this substance had power. Power to heal, to connect, to inspire, to celebrate. And also power to destroy, to disorder, to diminish. They tried to manage that power through ritual, regulation, and religious framing. They succeeded sometimes and failed other times, just as humans do now. The relationship is old and it's complicated, and that's because human nature is old and complicated. Let's end with something that puts all of this in the widest possible perspective. We've covered 10 million years of primate biology, 13,000 years of archaeological evidence, 7,000 years of documented brewing traditions, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and Greece and Rome and South America and Northern Europe. And through all of it, one pattern emerges with remarkable consistency. Humans, wherever they are, and whenever they lived, have found a way to ferment something. Grapes, grain, honey, rice, fruit, maize, potatoes, agave. If it has sugar in it, some human somewhere has figured out how to make it alcoholic. That's not a coincidence. That's not just hedonism. There's something deeper going on. Alcohol, used in the ways it most commonly appears in early human history, is fundamentally social. It's consumed in groups. It lowers the social barriers that make it hard for people to connect with each other. It's used to mark important moments: births, deaths, marriages, harvests, religious ceremonies, political alliances. It has been, throughout most of human history, woven into the fabric of how people come together and form communities. The act of sharing a drink is one of the most ancient and cross-cultural gestures of trust and fellowship we have. When Patrick McGovern, the archaeologist who analyzed that ancient Chinese pottery, was trying to understand why alcohol appears so consistently and so early in human history, he used a phrase that has stuck with me. Alcohol is the social lubricant of human civilization. And that might sound like a joke, but it's also a serious archaeological and anthropological observation. The communities that could gather together, share resources, coordinate labor, build trust across clan lines, those communities survived. They thrived, and alcohol, consumed communally and ceremonially, was a tool for building and maintaining those bonds. There's also this: making alcohol requires planning. It requires knowing which plants or grains to use, when to harvest them, how to prepare them, how long to wait. It requires vessels to hold the mixture. It requires knowledge passed from one generation to the next. In other words, alcohol production is a technology, and like all technologies, it drove human development forward. Brewing beer required pottery. Pottery enabled other forms of food storage. Food storage enabled sedentism. Sedentism enabled more complex social structures. Complex social structures enabled civilization. Each step connects to the next, and somewhere near the beginning of that chain, there's a curious primate standing over a gourd full of fermenting fruit thinking, in the most profound and consequential way to us, that this is interesting. We started this video with a thought experiment about a prehistoric human accepting a strange drink from a friend. But here's the thing. That moment happened probably millions of times across thousands of generations in forests and caves and valleys and river deltas all over the world. Humans tasted fermented fruit and grain and honey, and they didn't just drink it and move on. They thought about it. They experimented with it. They built rituals around it. They argued about it, regulated it, celebrated it, warned against it. They made it part of their stories about creation and divinity and the meaning of life. They offered it to their gods and buried it with their dead. And in doing all of that, they did what humans always do with the things that matter to them. They wove it into the story of who they are. The next time you raise a glass, whatever's in it, however you prefer it, you're participating in something that is, in the most literal sense, as old as humanity itself. Older even. You're part of a tradition that stretches back through 10 million years of primate evolution, through Natufian caves in ancient Israel, through Sumerian hymns and Egyptian tomb paintings, and Greek philosophical debates and Norse feasts in great wooden halls. That's either a very good reason to drink or a very good reason to think carefully about what we're doing when we do, maybe both.